Hello everyone, it's David from Automotive Press. As you know, two of my favorite vehicles in the world are right behind me. 2023 Toyota 4Runner, this is the 40th anniversary edition, and then my Lexus GX 460, both built in Tahara plant in Japan, which is perhaps the best factory in the world. And they both are based on the same platform, even built in the same factory line. But surprisingly, they do not drive exactly the same. Yes, I know this is a V8 and this is a V6, and that alone makes a huge difference. But in terms of feel on the road, in terms of the handling, the steering feel, all that stuff, it's actually quite different between the two models. So let me hop into both vehicles and tell you what the key difference might be in terms of driving feel between the 4Runner and the GX. Let's go. So now I'm inside my Lexus GX 460, and this is a brand new model, 2023 version. And when you compare this to the 2023 Toyota 4Runner, you might be surprised how different they feel on the road. Most people assume that the GX 460 and the Toyota 4Runner feel about the same on the road because they share so many components and also share the basic chassis and the platform. But surprisingly, and maybe even shockingly, the two function and feel like quite a different vehicle. And I'm talking about the steering feel, the ride, the quietness, the handling, just the overall feel. And it's not just that the GX is quieter and more refined and smoother. It's not just that. The GX actually feel quite different on the road because it has a little bit more of an agile character. The steering has a bit more feedback. And if anything, the GX feels a little bit sportier than the 4Runner. So what I really mean is that the 4Runner feels more like a truck. It has a little bit more of a bumpy ride. The steering is a little bit slower. The feedback is a little bit more numb from the road. And overall, it feels a lot like driving a kind of standard truck, but just with a cab in the back. So much so that if you drive the 4Runner and I didn't tell you that it's an SUV, you would swear that you're driving a pickup truck. But in the case of GX, the engineers have done an amazing job of taking most of that truck feel out, to the point where this one is perhaps one of the smoothest and the most refined SUV out there. Even when compared to monocoque unitized body crossovers, this thing actually will not take a backseat to those vehicles. It is that much smoother, it is that much quieter, and surprisingly the ride is also a bit flatter and more stable than a comparable 4Runner. And perhaps the biggest and the most unexpected difference between the 4Runner and the GX is the way that the steering communicates with you. In the case of GX, which is based on the Land Cruiser Prado in Japan, the steering feels a little bit tighter and it's actually a bit heavier, maybe even 10 to 15% heavier than the 4Runner. And then when you make a quick turns like I'm doing right now, the actual steering input and the response to the steering input is faster. It feels a little bit more agile, and the overall character of this SUV is such that the whole thing just feels a little bit more nimble and a bit more fun to drive than the 4Runner. As I mentioned, the 4Runner feels more like a truck, and that includes the ride as well. The ride is a bit bumpier on the 4Runner. On the GX that I'm driving now, the ride is extremely smooth, and therefore the two cannot be more different. Even though they're based on the same chassis, same platform, and for the most part, they share many different components. So I think hopefully that makes sense to you. I'm going to hop into my 4Runner now and tell you a little bit more about the difference between the two, because there are other subtle differences such as the size of the steering wheel, which is much larger on the 4Runner, and so forth. So let me hop into the 4Runner now and tell you a little bit more about the difference between the GX and the 4Runner. So I've now stepped into the 2023 Toyota 4Runner, and is there a lot of difference? Well, you'll be surprised once again how much of a difference there is in the overall feel because of the steering, because of the engine and the transmission between the Lexus GX and the 4Runner. The biggest, most obvious difference between the two might be the V8 versus a V6 and a 6-speed versus a 5-speed, but actually the steering feel and the steering character are very different. So for example, on the Lexus GX, the steering has a pretty good feedback. It's reasonably heavy, it's communicative, and I feel like I'm directly connected to the road even though I'm driving a large body-on-frame SUV. Whereas on the 4Runner, it feels very much like a truck, and the steering is a little bit lighter, a bit more numb. It doesn't feel anywhere as connected to the road as I do in the GX. And I know that sounds a little bit surprising because two shares so many components, including some of the steering mechanism, but for some reason they lighten the steering feel on the 4Runner, which means that the power assist might be a little bit overboosted compared to GX. And because the GX was designed for Asian and European market who prefer more of the European feel, it has a little bit more dialed in character. Gives you a little bit more feedback, a better communication between the road and your hands. Whereas on the 4Runner, the steering is large, it feels a little bit more numb, and definitely more truck-like compared to the GX. Also, I just went over some bumpy road here, and the GX is very smooth, very controlled, even without the air suspension on some base models, whereas the 4Runner and a little bit more truck-like when going over bumpy road. It's actually still pretty good, and it's still pretty smooth, but the GX has edge over the 4Runner in terms of ride quality. In terms of braking, the two are very similar. I do think that the pedal feel and the brake feel is a little bit better on the GX, but not a huge difference between the GX and the 4Runner. And also the difference in quietness is noticeable. They both are very robust, they both have a very solid feel to it, and that character is definitely missing from many other modern crossovers and SUV, and which is why people like the 4Runners and people love the GX as well. But in terms of just comparing the GX to the 4Runner, if people say they are basically the same, they feel the same, that is totally not true at all. The two are quite different. The steering is quite different. Obviously, the engine is very different, and most of you will likely prefer the GX over the 4Runner if you have a chance to drive them back to back. Now, coming back to the V8 versus V6, that's also a big difference as well. You step on the V8 engine in the GX, it takes off pretty briskly, but also very smoothly. It's got a really good grunt feel to it, yet very organic and that beautiful, naturally aspirated V8 feel. Whereas on the 4Runner, the engine gets a little bit louder. It struggles a little bit more when you're going uphill, for example, and when you step on it, it does take off, but a little bit slower than a GX and not as fun to drive because it's not quite as engaging, and when you step on the gas, there's a bit of a delay to get up to the certain speed. So those are some of the differences I've noticed. Both the GX and the 4Runner uses hydraulic power steering, whereas most modern crossovers and 99% of the cars for that matter uses electric power steering. So right away, the GX and the 4Runner have an advantage over other models because hydraulic power steering provides better feel and more communicative feel between the road and your hands. And therefore, you'll probably be happy with both vehicles. But if you don't mind paying a little bit more for the GX and you don't mind spending a little bit more money on the gas, then I will still go for the GX. It's almost a perfect SUV in terms of providing that beautiful V8 feel and a really silky smooth feel that is superior to the 4Runner. As you know, I've owned 7 different types of 4Runners and 4 different types of Lexus GX. So I'm really experienced in driving both and owning both. And now that I've gotten used to the GX versus the 4Runner, it's going to be a little bit harder for me to go back to buying the 4Runner and let go of the GX, because I definitely do prefer the GX versus the 4Runner. So I hope this video was helpful. I know this is just comparing the driving character and driving feel because I've done many other videos about the GX versus the 4Runner, so please go and take a look at those if you want to know, for example, the difference in quality or difference in terms of features and so forth. But this video was really dedicated to talk about the difference in the driving character, because so many people wrongly assume that the Lexus GX and the Toyota 4Runner feel the same on the road, and they're actually quite different. You'll have to drive both of them back to back to decide which is the right one for you. But for me, it was pretty obvious that I'm going to stay with the GX, even though I also love the Toyota 4Runner. If this video was helpful, I would appreciate it if you can give me a thumbs up, make some comments, and if you haven't done so yet, would you kindly subscribe, and that would be truly, truly appreciated. But until next video, I'm signing off for now. Thank you so much.